Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a Senior Consultation Specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. With me today is my usual co-host, Jennifer Ashwazage Pereira, my colleague, and an Indigenous Engagement and Traditional Knowledge Specialist at Atkins Realis. Jennifer is a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, located on the French River south of Sudbury, and works with me on our projects across Canada. Hello, Jen. Happy Tuesday to you.
Happy Tuesday. How are you?
Good. Hanging in there, hanging in there. So today, Jen, we're going to talk about the vegetation studies that we're going to be doing as that we have been and are going to be doing as part of the environmental and impact assessments. So, with that, maybe you can give everyone a bit of a background on this project, just so we get everybody up to the same level.
Well, I hope I can, Don. My dog, my friend there, is barking away in the background. That's Princess Xena Thunderpaws, by the way, who you're hearing her
Thunder
feedback from.
pause.
Yes, Princess Xena Thunderpaws. So we wanted to give a little bit of background on this project. So the Northern Road Link is a proposed all-season road in Treaty 9 area, which is located in Northern Ontario, and that will connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the all-season highway network via the proposed Martin Falls Community Access Road, as well as provide a chance for Webequie First Nation to connect to the all-season highway network from the Webequie Supply Road. And we know that the Ring of Fire is considered one of the most promising mineral development opportunities in Ontario, with several different minerals, and those are chromite, cobalt, nickel, copper, and platinum. And the Northern Road Link is subject, as Don said earlier, to the Environmental Assessment Act, and that's from the province, and the Federal Impact Assessment Act. And so are the Martin Falls Community Access Road and the Webequie Supply Road. And the proponents, which is something I love about this project, are Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. And those are remote communities in Treaty 9 territory, about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, and they're not currently accessible by all season roads. We know that they have winter roads, and we know that the season wasn't too great this past winter. And there's been a number of studies done on the all season road to the Ring of Fire, and that was the agreement was signed rather in 2020, so 4 years ago, between Martin Falls, Webequie, and Ontario. And everyone agreed to conduct an environmental assessment for the project that is funded by the province. And I will throw it over to you, Don.
Thank you, Jen. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project interacts with the other two all-season road projects that are currently undergoing environmental assessments and impact assessments. So Northern Road Link project sits between Webequie Supply Road project, which is to the north, and that runs from Webequie Airport on their reserve to the McFalds Lake area or Ring of Fire area. It then connects with the Northern Road Link North End, planned Northern Road Link North End, which then runs down where it will meet up with the Martin Falls Community Access Road, which then runs down and will connect with the provincial highway network. And all three of these projects were started at different times for different reasons. Webquay Supply Road started first, followed by the Martin Falls Community Access Road, and then the Northern Road Link project. So the purpose of these roads, different purposes, but ultimately what will happen is that both Webequie First Nation and Martin Falls First Nation, who are both remote communities will become connected to the provincial highway network, and the Ring of Fire mineral zone will then become connected to the provincial highway network as well. So economic activity will benefit communities in the region, and uh, and there will be an ability for the ore that's mined to be then transported to market along the Northern Road Link and Martin Falls Community Access roads. As usual, a all-season road is not just a two-lane gravel road. It is more than that. This road is a is planned to be a multi-use gravel road. It could be anywhere from 117 to 164 kilometers in length, depending on the different alternatives that are selected in the end, and there hasn't been a preferred alternative selected yet. There would be a right-of-way of approximately 100 meters with a cleared area of 60 meters. There would be numerous water crossings involving mainly culverts, maybe small bridges, but one large bridge crossing of the Attawapiskat River, which would be more than 200 meters. As with other all-season roads, there would be ancillary infrastructure, including storage and laydown areas, maintenance facilities and yards, access roads to the aggregate sites where the material to build and maintain the road with would be mined, and finally, construction camps would be used to accommodate the workers, and typically the storage and laydown areas are associated with these construction camps. So let's move now to talk about the main topic for today, which is the vegetation studies, and talk a bit about the purpose of these studies. The main purpose is to establish a baseline for vegetation. So I've talked before about the importance of establishing a baseline in an environmental assessment or an impact assessment, and that gives us something to compare to. So we can identify potential impacts of the project. So these studies collectively will allow us to sort of paint a picture of of the vegetation in the study area of the project. And speaking of that, we have to have assessment boundaries, so limits within which we conduct these studies. And so we have two different types. We have the temporal, which are time boundaries, and these would be based on the phase, whether it's a construction phase or an operations phase. Construction phase could range anywhere from 3 up to maybe 10 years. Operations phase is considered over a period of 75 years. That's considered to be the lifespan of a road like this. Then we also have spatial boundaries, and so there's two different study areas that we're working with as part of these vegetation studies. There's the local study area, which extends a kilometer from the boundary of the preferred corridor, whose width is 2 kilometers. And then there's the regional study area, and that extends 5 kilometers from the LSA boundary, from the local study area boundary. So that's basically 6 kilometers from the boundaries of the preferred corridor. So local study area and a bigger regional study area. Those are the two. Then we get into something called valued components. And plants and vegetation communities are considered valued components within the biological environment. So what do we mean by that when we say valued components? Well, they're components of the environment identified as important and or sensitive to change, are of concern or of value for cultural or traditional purposes, and they're likely to interact with the project or project activities. So I like to describe it as, in one way, as what's important to community members. So it could be what, Jen? It could be what? Aboriginal treaty rights and interests, right? That's one. It could be physical environment, it could be biological environment, it could be socioeconomic environment, it could be archaeological resources, it could be cultural heritage resources, or human health. There's a lot of different potential valued components associated with the vegetation studies or associated with the environmental assessment. Let's now move to talk a little bit about the indicators. What is an indicator? So indicators are ways of measuring um, uh, and report on the condition of a valued component. So every VC, every valued component has indicators. So for example, for plants and vegetation communities, valued components could be vegetation type abundance, meaning quality and quality of vegetation, or biodiversity. So when we talk about vegetation type abundance, um, it could be two things. It could be the quantity of each type of vegetation, like how much area it occupies. It could be the quality of vegetation of the vegetation community type. Um, so how could we measure impacts of the project? Well, we could do that by measuring changes in the total area of communities from building the project. Um, and then we have vegetation biodiversity. So just I'm trying to explain some of this terminology because there's a lot of terminology associated with this. So in terms of vegetation biodiversity, there's two things. There's species, what you call species richness, which is the number of species in an area. And then there's diversity, and that refers to the number of species, but also the abundance within the local and regional study areas. So how could we measure impacts on vegetation biodiversity? So the project may have effects on biodiversity. They could be direct changes to the species presence, meaning that species may not be present anymore, or indirect changes as a result of the habitat availability, meaning is there less of that particular habitat available due to the fact that the presence of the road, or even the quality, less of a certain quality of habitat as well. So that's how impacts would be measured. Now, in terms of desktop and field methods, I don't want to get into too much detail, but I just want to give people an idea of basically how that works. We do a desktop analysis, which would be what you call a habitat classification exercise, where we look at the habitat within the two different study areas. And then we look at satellite imagery or aerial imagery, and we start drawing lines on maps to classify it at a high level in terms of the different types of habitat. And then surveys are conducted, and the surveys are done to try to refine and sort of better sort of map those habitat areas. And so fortunately in Ontario, we have something called the ecological land classification, which is a way to, it's sort of a standard way to identify and classify vegetative communities. Um, and so we do a lot of different methods when we do our field work, but basically the easiest way to describe it is we're going out in the field and we're taking a selected areas within each vegetation, each habitat classification, and looking at them in more detail and then refining boundaries so we can map the vegetation communities in the different areas. Because we need to know these to know what the potential impacts of the project might be.
That's right. And environmental monitors are important in this process as well.
Great point, Jen. Yeah, huge, very, very important, right? I mean, obviously, community members working with us doing the surveys in the first place is important, um, because they know the land way better than we do. But especially during the construction phase, and also during operations, but especially during the construction phase, having local community members out in the field, on the front lines of construction, being able to look out and ensure that the construction activities are being conducted properly, right, within according to the environmental management plan. We've talked about these before, haven't we, Jen? And
Right.
that's why these monitors are so important because they know the land. They're familiar with the plants, and if they're not, they 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 will become familiar very quickly so that they can sort of serve as the lookouts for the project to make sure that we're not causing um, more impacts than we expected.
Yeah, and they can
So
identify the places of importance far better than our field
exactly.
teams.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just because the knowledge of the land, right, in the waters is just so much better. So these surveys are conducted, and we use them to refine classification of the vegetation units. And so we do that as part of the habitat modeling. And then we do species distribution modeling, where we model the data used to develop and so you do that to sort of develop predictive maps to sort of where different species and the abundance of different species in different areas. And this is all about sort of painting that picture so we have the information we need to predict impacts. That's what it's all about. So now let's move to talking a bit about assessment of effects. So now we're getting down to, okay, we've established the baseline. Let's look at the project activities and see what the effects might be um, on these areas. So this is sort of a stepwise process.
Hmm.
We identify the interactions between the valued components and the project and the possible effects based on the different activities involved in the project within each phase, whether it's construction or operations. Um, so when you identify effects, you need to identify mitigation measures. Now, that's a word I've used a lot. Mitigation is a way to limit or minimize or sometimes eliminate impacts. So if
Yes,
you identify effects, you need to identify ways of trying to minimize those effects, right, Jen? Like it
that's right.
can't have one without the other, right? So
That's right. Because we don't,
and
we
then
want to make sure
and
we're
then the
not
next
doing too much damage.
exactly, that's right. And then the next point is identification and characterization of visual effects. So what does this mean exactly? Well, or residual
Hmm.
effects. Residual means leftover. So after you've done all the mitigation, right, all the effort to try to minimize those impacts, what effects are left over? And then, of course, cumulative effects assessment. When we talk about cumulative effects, we're talking about the effects of not just that project, but any other um, past, current, or reasonably foreseeable future projects, combining the effects of the residual effects of all of those together with the residual effects of this project and seeing what you have after that. And then, of course, when we do that assessment of effects, we also put together what we call commitments and monitoring programs. So we make
Hmm.
commitments, promises, right, to do certain things to ensure that impacts are minimized. And then monitoring, right, development of monitoring programs. This is something really important and something that will involve community members to a large degree um, because these
Over a long
projects, once they're
period of
built,
time.
over a very long period of time. You're right, Jen. And the idea is that community members become stewards, right? Caretakers, monitors. They already are as community members, but they take an even more special role once this project is completed because it's their job to help make sure that whatever was promised in terms of when this project was delivered to prevent further impacts to the environment is actually followed through on. So then there's monitoring done to make sure that that nothing unexpected is occurring out there. And if there is, then then corrections have to be made to ensure that the project is behaving as it was predicted to behave. So now that takes us to our second last slide, and that's the use of Indigenous knowledge in vegetation studies, Jen. And you know about this. Um, we've had conversations with community members about this, and it's all about trying to understand where plants or vegetation in general fit into their activities, right?
Right. So we talked a little bit about that. So knowing what the cultural values are in different areas. So that could be medicines. It also could be areas where animals like to hang out and eat, and just all kinds of different. There's so many things here with respect to Indigenous knowledge, because there's so many things that we know about the land that not necessarily scientists will know, because we talked about that in some of our earlier sessions, Don, in our earlier streams, that the
Yep.
local people know where everything is, right? Because these lands are homelands, and I think, well, I keep saying we, but I'm an Anishinaabe, and in my territory, we kind of know where everything is. So a couple of my favorite spots, like I would know where there's a heron rookery that I like to go visit from time to time. I say I like to stalk them, and I take pictures with a long lens. So that's one of my hobbies, is to sit and watch the herons. There's 5 large nests there. I know of some places where we can pick certain medicines that will help alleviate things like poison ivy that we have in our territory, and stuff like that. So I can just imagine being or living in a remote community, that you would have so much more knowledge about your territory, and the uses and the important areas and species that are used, not just by human beings but by our furry relatives.
Our furry relatives, I like that, Jen. That's a great that's a great description. I'll have to remember that one. That's really good. Furry relatives, yeah, that's
Our
great.
furry
So
relatives, that's it, and our feathered
yes,
relatives as well.
and our feathered furry and so that wraps up today's discussion of the vegetation studies, and we hope it was helpful. And I know there's a lot of information in there, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to provide those to us. Uh, and we encourage you to join us again next week when we're going to talk about groundwater and surface water studies. So don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, northernroadlink.ca, Miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates on social media
Yeah.
and our website. Thanks for
All
joining me,
right,
Jen.
Chimigwech. All right, Bama Pidon.